Shout-outs this week to some of our listeners who like history. History comes in all different forms depending on the time period. This week's episode is all about 20th century history in America, so we think you'll like it. Kelly from Baton Rouge, Jonathan from Fort Lauderdale, and Gabby from Toms River, New Jersey. Thanks for keeping history alive. Here's this week's question from the mailbag. If you could do more episodes on history, what time period would you want to cover? That's a good question, and it's one that I think about a lot. The answer is actually a two-parter. If it were just for me, I'd like to learn more about the 1800s and the American Civil War, but that's why I like to listen to podcasts like History That Doesn't Suck that delves into that more deeply. And there's a host there, Greg Jackson, who really knows the subject matter. But what we're finding is our listeners like us to mix it up. With that in mind, I think I'd like to focus more on people, events, and things from the past 50 years. That's somewhat current or recent, and chances are we'll have listeners who remember some of the history we're talking about. And I really like it when we hear from people that were there or people that remember it. Thanks for that question. If you have a question or comment, send it to me through email at tim@shapingopinion.com. If you want, we can give you a shout out. And as always, thank you for being a listener of the Shaping Opinion podcast. You're the reason we do this. This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Casey, in your research, would you describe Richard Nixon as an introspective person?
Very much so. Richard Norton Smith, who was a historian that Nixon knew and admired his work, he often said that Nixon was an introvert miscast in an extrovert's world. In other words, he was a sort of a reclusive intellectual loner who was in the ultimate retail business, politics. And that obviously presented challenges to him. He was not a natural at the glad handing that goes on with most political campaigns and most politicians, but he was able to work through that and was pretty good at it, but it was not something that came naturally to him. What came naturally to him was thinking and reading and strategizing and writing notes on his yellow pads as he often did, and using his mind to come up with new ideas for confronting old challenges. And that's really a lot of what this book focuses on.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Casey Pipes. He's the author of a new book about Richard Nixon that focuses on his years after resigning the presidency in 1974. The book is called After the Fall. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Casey about Richard Nixon's years in exile after he resigned the presidency in disgrace in 1974 and then mounted an unlikely comeback that few, if any, could have predicted. By the time he died, Richard Nixon had become an elder statesman and an advisor to other presidents, both Democrat and Republican. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. Most may not realize it today, but he was never impeached, though impeachment was imminent as a result of the Watergate scandal that brought down his presidency.
From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress. in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
What few could have predicted was how Richard Nixon would respond after leaving the White House that late summer day. But in less than 10 years, he had reestablished himself as an advisor to presidents on campaign strategy and foreign policy. He helped influence U.S.-Soviet relations, and he was asked to represent the United States at state funerals. In short, by then he had become a respected elder statesman. Casey Pipes decided to take a deep dive into those years to find out just how the former president did it.
Well, I'm always interested in the road less traveled in research, the books that haven't been written, the stories that haven't been told. The first book I did was a story of Dwight Eisenhower and civil rights, which came out in time for the 50th anniversary of the Little Rock Central crisis, and showed Eisenhower really wrestling with his own racism and overcoming it and becoming something of a champion of civil rights, the story that had never been told before. This book is the same way. No one has ever done the full 20-year period of Nixon's post-presidency. There's been pieces of it that have been done. Robert Sam Anson did a book called Exile, which covered his first few years after Watergate. Of course, Monica Crowley wrote 2 memoirs of her time with Nixon at the very end of his life in the 1990s. But no one has ever told the story from August of 1974 to April of 1994. And so I wanted to research it, and I wanted to tell the story. And one of the reasons that it hasn't been told before is because the post-presidential papers, which I relied on heavily in researching and writing this book, are privately controlled by the family. They're not available for historians to look through. And so I had to get the permission of the family, which I was fortunate enough to do. And I was able to look at new material. And what I found, again, was somebody who was way more active during this time period than we've realized before, and way more successful at making his comeback. And that's what this book is all about.
Well, the comeback that you describe in the book starts with where we all know was Richard Nixon's resignation, and that was in August of 1974. Can you describe Richard Nixon's last day in the White House? What did he do? Who was by his side?
It's pretty surreal, and I describe it in some detail in the opening pages of the book. I mean, he tries to pretend it's another day of business as usual, but of course it's not. The staff is gathered in the East Room for one last address from their boss. His family, his immediate family, is with him, both Julie and David Eisenhower and Tricia and Ed Cox. There's a story of I came across in my research some of Tricia's personal recollections, which have never been seen before. She writes about what that day was like. She writes about running into George H.W. Bush in the Rose Garden, and he expressed great sorrow for the president and for her. And she writes about the plane ride back and how sad it was. And they watched on a closed circuit television the Ford speech as he took over, and she sort of reacted negatively to the speech. I mean, she thought it was not very gracious or gracious enough towards her father. But that I think that's just sort of a testament to how sad all of them were and how miserable all of them were. And they arrive back in California, and it's the first time he's landing back in California since 1969, and he's no longer president. And it's sort of a back to reality moment. They take him back to La Casa Pacifica in San Clemente, and the gardens around the house, which some of the local Republican groups had been taking care of over the years, have been overgrown. People have sort of abandoned, helping take care of the house, which is kind of a metaphor for where he finds himself. People have left him and abandoned him. And just a very, very sad moment, one of the saddest moments of his life, one of the lowest points of his life. And that sort of begins the story. I mean, he begins at the lowest possible moment that we can imagine. Has to figure out, what do I do with the rest of my life? And do I sit around and wallow in this? or do I try to climb my way out of it and do something useful? I think fortunately for history and for the country, he decided to try to be useful and use his mind and his insight on foreign policy to become something of an advisor and counselor in his later years, and that's exactly what he achieved.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I read your book and I saw how you described it, the process you just described is something that took quite a while. On that first day, you mentioned it was a very sad day, obviously, it would be. He's publicly embarrassed. He has to go out publicly. He gets on Marine One at the White House, and by the time he lands in California, he's on a smaller helicopter, and it's no longer the president's helicopter.
That's right.
You also described Tricia's comments about the speech that President Ford gave when he was inaugurated as president. And I think the term you used in your book was that Tricia said there was no mention of Richard Nixon in those introductory remarks that Ford made as president. She said it was a shallow, selfish speech from a little man.
Yeah.
But that might be also, as you said, a reflection of how they felt about everything at that time. This was a low point for Nixon and also the Nixon family. But there was something that Richard Nixon said on that first day that kind of gives a hint of what was to come. And he was trying to reassure his daughters, and I think he used the term, "This is only a beginning."
Yeah, he actually said it to the staff in the East Room, that it's only a beginning always. The young must know it, the old must know it. It was the classic Nixon. I mean, he's never giving up. He's always seeing promise where there's problems. He's always seeing opportunity where there's obstacle. And even here at the lowest moment of his career, I think he, to some extent, imagined some sort of a resurgence. Now, I don't know that he could have imagined exactly the way it played out, but I think he certainly thought he had to try to do something with the rest of his life. I mean, he tells his chief of staff in his post-presidency, John Taylor, later on that, one of the reasons he's always working, because he never stops working. I mean, the whole 20 years, he's going to the office every day, he's writing memos, he's calling colleagues around the country and around the world, he's writing best-selling books. He's always working. He's working in some ways harder than ever. And he says to his chief of staff, John Taylor, that I have to do this for my own sake. It keeps me sharp, it keeps my mind going, it keeps me alive. So I think he always imagined a future where he was working. I don't know that he could have imagined the degree to which people accepted him again. He's accepted not only by political leaders, and I talk in the book about his relationships with President Reagan and his staff, President Bush and his staff to a lesser extent, and then, of course, surprisingly, President Clinton. But he's also accepted by the public. I mean, the public, basically, by the end of his life, I don't want to say they've forgiven him, but they certainly have extended him a good deal of grace. And there's a whole series of events that lead to that moment. I mean, there's a whole series of things that happen in the public eye where people see him again, and they begin to think that, number one, he has paid quite a price for this, and number two, he still has a lot to say on foreign policy. I think people always acknowledged his mind for the world stage, and so he's able to achieve a level of acceptance that, again, in August of 1974, was unimaginable for most people, and I think to some extent was probably unimaginable to him. I mean, he knew he was in a big hole, and he wanted to try to climb out of it, but I don't know that he thought he would climb out as far as he did.
You describe in the book the end of that first day when he went to bed, and there was that one moment, and that's why I asked you earlier if he was introspective, because, and I think it's worth mentioning now that he comes from a different generation where you don't show your feelings publicly. You always put your best face out there, even no matter how you're feeling. And then he was a politician, so he had that in spades. So he wasn't going to reveal any vulnerabilities in public. And that was just his nature, and also the nature of a lot of people of his age. But at the end of that day, he dropped his guard a little bit. And I think you mentioned at the very end of the day, that's when he wept. And and he only did that in private in front of his wife, Pat. And I think the terminology that you mentioned he used was he felt that he let her down. So that was in private. he did something that people probably wanted to see in public, and I don't mean just his critics or his opponents. They wanted to see him show some vulnerability. They wanted to see him accept responsibility for what he did or may not have done, and that got him into the trouble that he got into. Did he ever feel that he should have shown that, or was he just cast from a different era?
I think he is from a different era. I think in his own way, he felt like he had shown, or he did show some remorse throughout his career. I talk quite a bit about some of the apologies he makes over the course of the years, beginning with the Frost interviews, where he talks about how, I let people down, it was my fault, and I impeached myself. He would never admit criminal wrongdoing. At no point in his exile did he ever admit he had broken a law, but he certainly felt like morally he had let people down. And it is fascinating, again, just thinking back on those first few days and how distraught he was and how wrecked he was emotionally. You mentioned him, crying in front of his family that first night. He also, as he was sort of sitting slumped on the couch at La Casa Pacifica back in home with his family, he talked that night about his place in the world, how his policy goals had been unfinished because now his presidency would be unfinished, which I think in some ways is some foreshadowing of later sections of this story where in some ways his pursuit of kind of an informal advisory role with Reagan and Bush and Clinton, in some ways he's attempting to finish the foreign policy work of his administration, particularly with Reagan on the Cold War. I mean, he clearly saw in the 80s there was a unique moment in time with Gorbachev and Reagan to pursue something pretty meaningful and significant at the negotiating table. And I think in some ways he thought that was a continuation of his work in the Cold War. And again, it's just fascinating to watch how he used the only power he had left during his exile, which was the power of his mind and his insights, and leverage that to gain some level of influence on three American presidents.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about next then is the pardon, because that was a big issue. Richard Nixon was pardoned by Gerald Ford not too long after Gerald Ford became president. There was the public rationale for the pardon, and that is Gerald Ford said that he wanted the country to move on and that Richard Nixon paid a high enough price already. That was his public, and that may have been true, but there was a whole behind-the-scenes issue, and in fact, you said this was the beginning of Richard Nixon's troubles, not the end. What did you mean by that?
Well, he finds himself in the fall of 1974 facing enormous challenges on a number of fronts. Obviously, Watergate first among them. I mean, there's a very real chance without the pardon that there are legal repercussions that he may face. And he, at one point he says to one of his associates that I just as soon go through the agony of a trial so that we can scrape away at least all the false charges and fight it out on those where it may be a doubt. But I think internally he sort of knew he wasn't going to be able to withstand a trial. I mean, physically, his health was very bad. That was another challenge he faced. He's rushed to the hospital in October of 1974. They have to do emergency surgery on him because he has an attack of phlebitis, which is where the walls of the artery essentially become inflamed and the blood flow is restricted. I mean, he almost dies in October of 1974. So he has medical challenges, he has legal challenges, he has financial challenges. I mean, the man is broke. It's not apparent to him how he's going to make a living at this point. One of the fascinating things about this period of Richard Nixon's life is to think about him really reinventing the post-presidency. There was no template for him to follow. In August of 1974, there were no ex-presidents alive. Johnson had died in 73, Truman had died in 72, Eisenhower died in 69. So the three ex-presidents that Nixon had known and watched, they all went into retirement, almost, with few exceptions in their public life. I mean, they went away from the public eye. Eisenhower goes to Palm Springs half the year. He goes to Gettysburg half the year. Johnson goes to his ranch. Truman goes back to Independence. I mean, they disappear. And this was sort of the model of ex-presidents up to that time, that you don't really have anything to contribute. Nixon doesn't have that option. He can't retire and go away because he has no way to make money. And so out of necessity, he begins a very different type of ex-presidency where he's going to the office every day and he's writing books every day and he's promoting them in speeches and he's doing media interviews. And eventually he's advising 3 presidents. This is a fairly new phenomenon in American history, and it's really dates back to Nixon. If you think about the ex-presidents we have today, they're much closer to the Nixon model than they are Johnson, Truman, or Eisenhower. I mean, they're writing books, they're doing TV interviews, they're trying to influence policy. George W. Bush has his own think tank in Dallas devoted to influencing policy and turning out research on issues. This is all very Nixonian, and he invents this modern model of the post-presidency out of necessity because in the fall of 1974, he has to find a way to make money. And so he faces enormous challenges, and the Watergate pardon is important because it takes one of them away, but he still faces several others.
Question for you on Gerald Ford. How close did Gerald Ford come to not pardoning Richard Nixon?
Boy, I think it was pretty close. I mean, I think it was 50-50 at times. And if he had listened to most of his advisors, or many of his advisors, he probably wouldn't have done it. You know, we look back now in hindsight and think that this is a no-brainer. Ford did the right thing. I mean, Bill Clinton has said he did the right thing. Ted Kennedy awarded him the Profile and Courage Award for the pardon. I mean, Democrats now say this was the right thing because he saved the country from more Watergate. But at the time, that was not the conventional wisdom. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that, you know, he was bailing out his buddy and saving him from the consequences of his decisions. And I think it was a tremendous act of courage on Ford's part, and a tremendous act of wisdom. I mean, I think he was correct in doing it. I think he was correct in the fact that Nixon had been through a lot and probably wasn't going to survive a trial physically. And in fact, there's a conversation, you know, he has with one of his aides who's going back and forth to San Clemente to meet with Nixon. And he says, you know, I basically tells Ford, I don't know if he's going to make it. And so Ford decides that he wants to do the pardon, but he also, you know, Ford gets a bad rap on this. Ford drives a hard bargain. He wants a statement of remorse from Nixon. You know, after a series of negotiations with Ford's representative, Nixon puts out a public statement that says the way I tried to deal with Watergate was the wrong way, and it's a burden I shall bear every day for the rest of life that's left to me. So a pretty candid confession that, again, he didn't do anything criminal in his mind, but he certainly was at fault. Morally, he was at fault. And it was enough for Ford, and he issued the pardon. And again, he paid a tremendous political price, as we know. Probably cost him the presidency in the 76 election. But frankly, it was, I think most historians would say now, the right thing to do for the country.
Well, that would be one of the first of many apologies or acts of humility on Nixon's part to regain the good graces of the country. You mentioned the negotiations there, and then there were another series of negotiations in 1977. In 1977, you describe it as a period where the interviews and the apologies start. And that's where the David Frost interviews come to play. And now David Frost, if people aren't familiar with him, he was a very, very famous TV host. He was one of those people that if you were anybody and you were interviewed by David Frost, it was a big interview. So David Frost gets an interview with Richard Nixon, and these are really the first major TV interviews with
Correct.
Richard Nixon after the resignation.
Correct.
And there's a set of negotiations prior to the interviews, and I thought that was pretty interesting because you described that. What did David Frost negotiate, and what did Richard Nixon negotiate before those interviews took place?
I think in the simplest terms, Frost got editorial control, which he desperately wanted to have, and Nixon got money. And again, this goes back to Nixon being in such a desperate situation. He needed money desperately, even in 1977. So he gets $600,000 for the interview, negotiated by his agent, Swifty Lazar. It's a huge sum of money. But, for Frost, it's a bargain. I mean, the interviews are a staggering television success. The first episode of the interviews that were shown in 1977 drew an audience of 45 million Americans. To put that into perspective, that is still, to this day, the largest audience ever to watch a political interview. It's astonishing. And so it was a good deal for both of them. And, Frost got what he wanted. Nixon got what he needed. And I think, frankly, again, there's this myth with the Frost interviews that, Nixon didn't want to do them, or Nixon was, unprepared to answer some of the tougher questions on Watergate. And what I found in the research was quite different. He certainly knew these questions were going to come up, and he was willing to address them. He wanted the public, he wanted the 45 million people watching to hear him address the issue. And it was a part of the comeback. It was a part of his trying to make peace with the country, that he wanted to address this issue and speak to it and show some remorse, although not express any criminality. And that's basically what he tried to do in the interview. So it's a very important piece of this story, and it's a commonly known piece of the story. We've had books and movies and plays done on this topic, but there are some misconceptions about how the interview went down.
You described what Nixon said. He basically apologized and took the blame for Watergate and for everything that he did. Was it a success for Nixon from the standpoint of rehabilitating his image in the public's eye?
I think it was a step forward. I don't know that it was a total success because, again, he's talking about issues that are not his strong point. I mean, he's talking about many of his failures. But it nevertheless gave him the chance to speak to millions and millions of Americans. It gave him the chance to address Watergate. I mean, in many ways, it's the first time people had heard him specifically address Watergate ever, or at least since he left the presidency. So it was a remarkable moment in that sense. I can't say that it was a complete victory for Frost or complete success, but I think it certainly was an important part of the comeback. It allowed people to see him talking about these issues, and many times for the first time. In many ways, for the first time.
Well, that was 1977. In 1978, actually in the beginning of 1978, Richard Nixon turns 65 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And a key thing happens there from an unlikely person. He had beaten Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 presidential race to win the presidency. And he had done it soundly and as anybody would imagine, brutally, because whenever two people are running for president, the politics can be pretty brutal. Yet it was Hubert Humphrey now in 1978, his former political opponent, who was dying of cancer. And those two were talking. They had maintained a relationship over the years. And Hubert Humphrey had talked to Richard Nixon and was concerned after a phone call with Nixon because he said that he felt that the former president was isolated. And I think in your book and in Hubert Humphrey's words, he said, no former president should live in exile from the nation's capital. That was his observation. What he then does is he knows he's dying, and he knows that he will lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda.
Right.
And he invites Richard Nixon to his own funeral. And he knows what that means. He knows that this means that Richard Nixon will now make a return trip to the Capitol for the first time since resigning the presidency in disgrace. So what Hubert Humphrey really knows he's doing is he's helping Richard Nixon return to public life. He knew this. How important was that?
I think it was a huge moment, precisely because it came from the Democrat who had opposed him in 1968. When Humphrey called him and invited him to attend the funeral, and Humphrey was dying of cancer, as you say, Nixon hung up the phone and said to his chief of staff, Jack Brennan, I don't care what it takes, I'm going to the funeral, start working on it. And so Nixon appreciated the gesture. He certainly knew what it meant. He certainly knew it represented a chance for people to see him attending his former rival's funeral. It was his first public appearance in Washington since Watergate. It's I think a very remarkable moment and says a lot about Humphrey, that this is the kind of person that he was. I mean, he had every reason to wish ill upon Nixon or not want to be a part of helping rehabilitate him, but on the contrary, he wanted Nixon to be there, thought he should be there, and wanted the country at large to see him there. That story is in the book, and it's just a fascinating piece of this comeback story that a former rival helped in some ways open the door to the public for Nixon.
That is an interesting story, and that is a turning point, because then after this, Nixon follows a process. So we've already talked about the fact that he's publicly apologized doing a TV interview. He's attended a public funeral with Hubert Humphrey, and now he starts to write his way back into public life. He starts to write his memoirs. He starts to make public appearances, and he's very selective in this, but he's also very dedicated to doing this and committed to it. And as you said, he liked to use his mind, so while he loved to write, he would end up writing 10 books over the course of these 20 years. He would focus on foreign policy. That seemed to be his sweet spot. And as you said, he was working on unfinished business from his own presidency, which meant he was going to focus on the Soviet Union and China, particularly when he talked about foreign policy, which made sense at that time because they were the other two superpowers, and that's where most of the public's attention was and the government's attention was on foreign affairs. He looked at the problems, and as you said, he became an advisor. He became a public statesman on these issues when he wrote. He not only wrote books, he wrote opinion pieces in major newspapers and major media. And he actually visited some of these countries. He went to China not too long after. He met with some people from China. So he started to serve as an emissary for the country. But in the 1970s, before 1980, he didn't do this with Jimmy Carter's blessing, did he?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, the two were not close at all. Nixon was very skeptical and very critical of Carter as a foreign policy president. He sees Carter sort of setting the stage for what happens in the 80s, which is Reagan. I mean, he kind of sees the weakness of the Carter foreign policy as opening the door for the strength of Reagan. And it's interesting, you mentioned his book writing. He writes a book during this period called The Real War, which becomes very influential in foreign policy circles. He essentially takes a harder line on the Soviet Union in the book than he had really as president, and says that basically in this book that the Soviets want world control, that they want world domination, and frankly that they're winning, both in terms of strategic weaponry and conventional weaponry and global strategy. And so, the book argues for a massive increase in arms, military arms. It argues for sending weapons to allies around. It basically sort of anticipates the Reagan doctrine. And Reagan, of course, reads the book and is very influenced by it. And in 1981, in many ways, begins putting in place a foreign policy that sounds a lot like the one Nixon described in the Real War. So it's fascinating how, again, his books and his intellect were very, very relevant during this time period and played an important role in what we see during the Reagan presidency.
And the Reagan administration did turn to Nixon for advice. They may have done this on the QT at first, but they did turn to Nixon for advice. And as you said, they may have quietly respected his writings and his thoughts on these things. It would start to emerge more publicly over time. In fact, by 1984, Nixon was a little bit more public about his opinions and also his support of the Reagan policy. And there was one thing that you had mentioned in your book that I think is worth mentioning here, because while we talk about all of this, I can almost hear a listener thinking, well, geez, this is a PR podcast for Richard Nixon. There was a very, very skeptical media out there and a very skeptical public about Nixon, and we know this, and it never stopped.
George Chaplin, Honolulu Advertiser, Mr. Nixon. Has the level of your affection for the press changed in recent years?
Is it what?
Has
I just want that repeated, if you don't mind.
Has the level of your affection for the press changed in recent years?
Has it changed?
Yes.
Well, I think maybe I don't think the press has changed, and as far as I'm concerned, I probably have changed some. Let me understand. There has to be an adversarial relationship between press and candidate. There has to be adversarial relationship between press and whoever is in office. I would like to say in that respect that I greatly admire the way President Reagan handles the media. He's fast on his feet and he knows how to slip those punches better than most anybody in recent times. However, as far as I personally am concerned, as Vermont Royster and Reed Black and Herb Klein and others who will agree, I cherish many friendships in the press. Many of them are not my supporters on issues are concerned. And as far as those that are not friends, that are critics, I respect them. But when they give it to me, I give it back, just in kind, and that's the way it's going to be.
John Herbers wrote in the New York Times in 1984 that Nixon's TV interviews at that time were just another step in Nixon's effort to erase the stigma of Watergate, which may have very well been true. I mean, Nixon was always trying to erase that stigma, so that wasn't in dispute. He was definitely trying to recover from that. Question is, was he doing it effectively, and even maybe more importantly, was he doing it credibly?
Well, I think he certainly was being effective at it, and I think, the John Herbers of the world, there's a whole series of these folks, these critics and journalists throughout this period who are sort of monitoring from afar Nixon's activities and take a very critical look at them. They take a cynical look at them, really. They view it as sort of a continuation of the cover-up. I mean, Stephen Ambrose, upon the opening of the Nixon Library, the historian Stephen Ambrose comments that the cover-up continues, that this is all part of rewriting history and rewriting Watergate. I suppose people can see it that way, but again, on the other hand, if you're Richard Nixon in 1974 and you have no money and you have no job, what else are you going to do? You're going to try to be active and you're going to try to be useful. And what's the best way to be active and useful? Well, use your expertise on foreign policy and write books and try to be an influencer on that. And so I think there's a less cynical approach to this. Again, I don't see a lot of evidence of Nixon he never wrote a book trying to explain Watergate away. I mean, the closest he gets is the memoir. He's talking about the future. He's not talking about the past. And so I think the critics during this time are very cynical about his activities, but in fact, I think there's a more logical explanation for what he was doing, which was simply he wanted to be useful. He sensed that the Cold War was reaching something of a climax, and I think with Reagan and Gorbachev particularly, he sensed that he could be helpful during this period, and it turns out that he was.
Well, I remember that time period pretty well myself, and during a part of those years I worked in the media, and I can still remember the attitude, and I think that's where the checks and balances really do come to play, because you did have a cynical media and you had a cynical public, and Nixon knew that, and I don't think he ever felt that was an unfair thing. I think what he looked at was his test. He had to meet that test of cynicism and skepticism of his motives. And yet, like you said, he just kept moving forward and focusing on the future, hoping that his place in history would be preserved. And that's what we're looking at now here in 2019. And I think one of the things and one of the events that you describe in your book that kind of points to this is when Nixon goes to Moscow in July of 1986. Now, this is after Reagan's been reelected. This is in Reagan's second term. This is when the cracks in the Soviet wall start to show themselves. There will be talk about the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is the thing that really scares the Soviet Union. It's what was called the Star Wars, and the Soviet Union felt that they could not match the United States if it would escalate the arms race into space. So that was something that concerned them, because even if they felt they could do it technologically, they didn't know if they could do it, if it would bankrupt them as a country. So if they tried to. So Reagan really called their bluff. That was what was happening on a foreign relations stage. All of these things were happening. America was putting the pressure on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was starting to buckle. With all of these things happening, I guess my question there is, what role did Nixon play?
Well, it turns out he played a much larger role than we've realized. We knew until now, we already knew about his trip to Moscow, his meeting with Gorbachev. You know, he came back and said, he talked about the three Soviet leaders he had met during his lifetime, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and then now Gorbachev in '86. And he said that Gorbachev of the three is the far ablest. He went so far as to say that he would put him in the same league with a Churchill or a de Gaulle in terms of his ability and his intellectual capacity. But he also wanted to use this interaction he had with Gorbachev to kind of nudge Gorbachev forward. At the same time, he's advising Reagan and encouraging Reagan to negotiate, but negotiate from a position of strength. He tells Gorbachev, you know, you better take advantage of these last years of the Reagan administration. This is 1986. There was less than 3 years left. And he says that, you know, he tells Gorbachev, Reagan is enormously popular with the American public, and this is the guy you want to do business with. This is the time to act. And so, you know, he said, you want to reach a deal with Reagan because you don't want him to use his popularity against you. You don't want Reagan to say to the American public that, you know, we couldn't do business with the Soviets. They still are an evil empire, essentially. And he later, you know, told Reagan this. He said, you know, I told him he needs to get a deal with you. And he said, you know, I don't think there was anything I said during the conversation that had a greater impact on him than that, than telling Gorbachev Reagan is enormously popular and now is the time. And so once the negotiations get very serious, as you mentioned, there becomes a sticking point in the negotiations, which is SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan wanted to build a nuclear shield to protect America and its allies from nuclear weapons that were fired. Nixon doubted the science of this. He doubted that technologically something like this could ever work. But he loves the leverage that it gives Reagan in a negotiation. And of course, Gorbachev hated SDI, was sort of scared of it. And at Reykjavik, you know, the famous summit meeting where Reagan and Gorbachev basically have a deal in place. And Gorbachev at the last minute says, now this is all contingent on you giving up SDI. And Reagan says, no, it's not, and storms out of the meeting. And the summit ends, you know, kind of in disaster. So SDI becomes a real major sticking point. And Nixon is one of the people who suggests to Reagan, maybe one of the ways you square this circle is you offer to share the technology with him. It's a defensive system. There's nothing to be afraid of. And if we build one, maybe they can build one too. And so Reagan does, in fact, offer Gorbachev to share the technology. It does sort of box Gorbachev in because it's like, there's nothing to be afraid of here. We're going to give it to you guys too. We're not trying to use it just for our own purposes. And I think that one idea, which we've never known Nixon's role in those decisions about that strategy, offering to share the technology probably did help lead Gorbachev back to the negotiation table. And the result eventually was the 1987 INF Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. So Nixon was surprisingly involved, much more involved with Reagan during this process and during this time than we've ever realized before. And that's a big part of the last half of this book.
Well, I don't want to give away the rest of your book because it is a very good read, and I'd recommend anyone to read it. But we do know that this continued through the Bush years, that under Bush, during the Bush years, Nixon was an advisor, but he and George Bush had their own relationship going back to when George Bush worked for him when he was president. But then in the early 90s, and now we're getting near the end of Richard Nixon's life, you have a Democrat, a very popular Democrat president, Bill Clinton, who was politically and maybe personally the polar opposite of Richard Nixon. He was charismatic. He wasn't an introvert. But they were both very wonky. Clinton more domestic, Nixon more on foreign policy. How would you describe that relationship, the relationship between Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon?
Well, politics makes for strange bedfellows. Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, against all odds, became fairly close. Clinton was the first to reach out. Bob Dole, ironically, was one of the people that encouraged him to call Nixon. He thought that Clinton could benefit from some foreign policy advice from him. And so he reached out to him, and he just was thoroughly impressed with Nixon. And they largely saw Russia, which was the main issue they talked about. They talked about Bosnia quite a bit too, but mainly Boris Yeltsin and Russia. They largely saw it the same way. Nixon had felt that the Bush administration had probably not done enough to hasten the collapse of the Cold War. They had not done enough to promote the democratic reformers inside of Russia. When the Baltic republics broke away, he wished that the Bush administration had done more to support them. And Clinton is a little more willing to be active in this space and to support Yeltsin's move, support the fledgling democracy there. And so he and Nixon sort of see Russia the same way, and that allows them to kind of work together on it. And of course, Clinton is so impressed with Nixon that when Nixon dies, he shows up in Yorba Linda and delivers a magisterial eulogy in which he says that may the day of judging Richard Nixon by only Watergate come to an end. It's just remarkable that a Democratic president would say that we can't just think about Watergate when we think about Richard Nixon. We have to think about his entire life and career. And that really was sort of the crowning moment of the Nixon comeback in death, that here was a Democratic president saying, we have to move past just Watergate. This man was much bigger than that and deserves to be remembered for much more than that. So it's really an amazing, amazing moment.
In the end, was Nixon able to put Watergate behind him?
I don't know that he put it behind him. I think he certainly was able to come to terms with it. He was able to find his way in his post-Watergate life to become active again, to become influential, to do meaningful work, which is what all of us want to do with our lives. He certainly knew it was a part of his legacy. He never tried to downplay it. He would often say that when he was asked about his place in history that, people will mention Watergate, but hopefully they'll mention all of the other achievements as well that happened. So he wanted a fair shake from historians. He wanted exactly what Bill Clinton said, that people judge him by more than just Watergate. And I think that he came a pretty good distance in the direction of making that happen. And again, considering where he was in August of 1974, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, here we are now in 2019, and we live in a different age. This is the social media age, the Twitter age, where entire policies are communicated in a single tweet. So everything is black and white and very simplistic. We also live in a time where the media is 24/7 and it's hitting us from all directions on the internet. So there are a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people have no idea that Richard Nixon in his lifetime did have these diplomatic and advisory accomplishments after he left office. All they know about him was that he left office in disgrace. So you've had cycles. You've had the period of disgrace, 1974. You've had that 20-year comeback while he was still alive. But now we're starting to look at history. Did Richard Nixon's comeback and all of the things that he did after his presidency, did they stick to the point where people still remember that when they think of his place in history?
Well, we'll find out. I mean, I think history is always being written, and I certainly won't be the last book written on this topic, I imagine. I do believe, from my own personal perspective, as I often say, historians will debate whether or not he was a great president. I don't think there's much debate that he was a great ex-president. And I think that story deserves to be told alongside all of his other accomplishments and his setbacks. I mean, he really redefined what an ex-president is and what an ex-president does. And I think that should be part of his legacy as well. And that's kind of part of what this book is all about.
Casey Pipes, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and appreciate the chance to come on and talk about a fascinating piece of the Nixon story that hasn't received a lot of attention, but hopefully it will now. His post-presidency is really a remarkable period, and I hope people will take a look at after the fall.
To learn more about Casey Pipe's book called After the Fall, The Remarkable Comeback of Richard Nixon, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you on Twitter. Just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you can get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.